My very first visit was at the age of 18. It came from my deceased grandfather. He was at the foot of the bed. He nodded to me and told me that I was not to worry about him being on the other side.
At the time it was happening, I just thought, oh, Mom's calling. And, of course, I realized that she could not be calling me because she had been dead for 11 years.
The fact that someone tells you they communicated with Aunt Millie or Uncle Joe doesn't necessarily make it true. And even if millions of people say that, it doesn't make it true.
Then afterwards, he was gone, and when I woke up, I could still feel his presence, his essence, tingling all around me, just as if somebody who was physically here had just touched me and hugged me and held me and kissed me.
The abiding myth that we will live on is the essential myth of our human personalities and of all of our cultures and civilizations.
And the next day in the afternoon, my grandparents told me that he had died. I guess the first place he went after he left his body was to my bedroom.
Many of us experience things, and science is denying that experience because it doesn't have the categories at the moment to measure it.
So I went down to 86 and Broadway to catch the subway to Midtown to work, and as I would pass people on the street and even in the subway station, I really wanted to tap people on the shoulder and say, "You're not going to believe what just happened to me. The love of my life, dead, gone 8 years, showed up in my apartment."
The whole essence of her being just went right through my body, and I don't know what to do with what happened. I feel like I should be screaming it out, that these people are really alive.
Hey, maybe people do survive death. I'm not quite sure myself. But somebody who says there's no evidence, they simply don't know what's out there.
About 2 weeks after his death, I woke up in bed and saw a light on somewhere else in the house. He was standing in the kitchen. It was very vivid. And I said, "Dad, we thought you were dead," and hugged him.
Interesting night. Glad you're here. Judy Guggenheim is with us, the author of Hello from Heaven. We're talking about after-death communications. This is a subject that is just at an all-time high as far as interest is concerned. And as we get close to the year 2000, the subject's almost mainstream.
We are conservatively estimating 50 million Americans have had an after-death communication. And the evidence is out there.
Millions of Americans have reported something like after-death communication or witnessing of apparitions, that sort of thing. And so the question is, well, what's going on? That's a lot of people seeing something that doesn't fit within the current, at least scientific understanding of the world.
These experiences have probably been with us since the dawn of mankind. Toddlers have them and will remark about great-grandma in the morning having visited her.
Start, say with 50 million, and you start chopping them down, saying, well, okay, let's get rid of 90% of it. That leaves an awful lot of people with very credible stories. And now what's going on?
I think there's a religious impulse in much of this, a kind of quasi-religious desire to verify the spiritual universe.
After-death communications, you still have time to call. Let's go back to Detroit.
Well, this is hard to talk about. I left and went to Fort Knox, Kentucky in 1980. I joined the Army. I think that was the happiest thing I did for my dad. He was dying of lung cancer. The day he died, November 22nd, he showed up in front of me just as solid as I was looking at him. He said, "Son, I'm proud of you. You're going to do good." And when I went to lunch, my drill sergeant came up to me and he goes, "Or I got something to tell you." And I looked at him, I go, "I know, my dad's dead."
How many times have you told this story?
Twice.
Yes.
We've examined hundreds and thousands of claims people make. eyewitness testimony of things that they want to believe. I mean, you have reincarnation, you have abductions, any number of wondrous things. So you have to carefully sort out testimony that people make. It may be deep felt, and surely life after death is a very important human interest. I mean, it's passionate, and there's a longing. There is what I call the transcendental temptation, a hankering after a world beyond. And so there is a natural propensity to believe, and here more than anywhere else.
This really is nothing new, this vehement attitude toward the possibility of survival. For example, in the 1600s, when Sir Isaac Newton proposed a radical idea called universal gravity, the skeptics went ballistic. They accused Newton of surrendering to mysticism. No one had ever been able to hold gravity in their hands. It was invisible. This sounded nuts. And so this really went over in Newton's time, much like this idea of survival goes over in our time.
From a physics point of view, we know that the energy doesn't go away. We know that the material body itself may crumble and turn into its constituent molecules and atoms, but it doesn't go away. It's all there. It's just it comes into a different form. And so it's not that difficult to imagine that what we think of as ourselves, as the consciousness of ourself, turns into a different form, because that's how everything else works as far as we know.
I used to build these gadgets in my bedroom, and one of the gadgets I built was a thing they call a cloud chamber, which is a device for tracking subatomic particles. There's a misty vapor, and the particle can be seen in the vapor. And the powerful thing about a cloud chamber is that there's nothing, there's just the vapor. And then suddenly there's a track going across, and then it disappears into nothing again. And when my baby was born, I remember that at the moment of her birth, that here there was nothing. Now there's this baby. And she was like the track going across the cloud chamber, and then one day she will just disappear again. But you see that you know from the cloud chamber that the subatomic particle isn't dying like we think. It's just simply going back into the quantum vacuum, back into the ground of being. So it comes out of the ground of being, it traverses at this level sometimes, and then it goes back to the ground of being. And I think it's impossible to see something like that and not have it affect your ideas of life and death.
We now know that the world is described by fundamental physics, mainly quantum mechanics, is strange enough to allow these weird interconnections between people's minds and the environment. That's the quantum interconnectedness that the physicists talk about. The world of the physical is strange enough to allow this. So it is no longer inconceivable that the forms of interconnection that the mediums talk about and that some psychics talk about is in fact a reflection of the way the world really is.
And suddenly, I've had a feeling of my mother's presence that was so strong. It was as if she'd come up and put her arms around me and give me a great big hug.
And about 6 feet away, this chair was against the wall, and Paul appeared. He was sitting on the chair. He was about 8 years old.
2 years after Karen died, I saw her, and it was like this joyous reunion. It was like, oh my goodness, and she comes out, and she hugged me and said, oh, Mom, it is so good to see you.
I looked in the doorway, and there he was, standing, you know, and he says, I'm not going to hurt you. He said, I just wanted to see you, you know, and with that, he faded out of the doorway. I was a nervous wreck.
I just know, you know, that this was not some self-appeasing fantasy of mine, but from some other person's consciousness, some other area of experience, not my own at all.